The abandoned city lay under a thick snowpack like a white mummy. Broken signs dangled, window glass froze in jagged sheets, and cars were buried to their doors along a silent boulevard. The task force crossed the intersection with weapons up, aiming into blacked-out windows. She walked at the tail. No rifle, only an empty sling like a public insult. "Without a gun, you're a burden," a veteran muttered. She didn't answer. When unfamiliar footsteps echoed from the building opposite, the second hand on her wrist jumped one mark. 90 seconds later, everything changed color. Snow softened the city's edges until everything looked unfinished, as if the buildings had been poured and never cured. The team moved in a staggered line, spreading out across an avenue that once carried commuters. Now it carried nothing but wind. Their boots left sharp prints, each step loud in the kind of silence that made the breath sound guilty. The mission brief had been spare: locate the hostage or recover the data, then extract. It had come down from a chain of commands nobody in the formation could see. The hostage was a technician who had vanished during the collapse. The data was whatever he had carried out: drives, codes, proof. The team had been the nearest asset, a specialized group used to operating in ruin, used to hearing the word asset before person. She walked last because that was the only place no one argued about. She had been assigned there without a vote. There was no rifle slung across her chest. The empty strap drew eyes the way blood drew flies. The reason for it had been written into her file and repeated in a hallway that still smelled of disinfectant. Not trusted. Not now. Not after what happened. The team leader, Captain Daniel Mercer, kept his face neutral. He did not defend her, and he did not pile on. He simply issued the order and let the chain do the rest. His second, Lieutenant Grant Halloway, was less careful. Halloway had the clean, muscular confidence of a man who had never been wrong in front of witnesses. He had been in the unit longer than Mercer, but Mercer had earned command with results and a refusal to play favorites. Halloway did not like either of those things. "Stay close and stay quiet," Halloway said, his voice low, cutting through the snow. It was a command that applied to everyone but landed hardest on her. She nodded once. She would have done that anyway. She was not there to argue. She was there to see. The city opened like a map to her. She read distances, angles, the way the snow clung to the lee side of a wrecked bus, and the way it had not clung to a set of steps that should have been buried. She watched the wind's direction change in alleys, and felt it as a pressure against her cheek, the kind that could push sound in one direction and hide it in another. They passed storefronts covered in ice. They passed a public transit station collapsed under the weight of last year's storm. Every so often she marked a route in her head. 1, 2, 3 turns that could lead out. She was not speaking because she was not asked. She was not speaking because her voice had been questioned, and would be questioned again. The team split to clear a cross street. Mercer held up a fist. Halloway peeled left with 2 men. Mercer peeled right with 2 more, and she stayed in the center by default, the space nobody wanted to fill. Her eyes lifted to the 3rd floor of a brick hotel that faced the intersection. The broken windows there were rimmed with frost. Something had moved behind the frost a moment before, or her mind had built it out of caution. She wasn't sure yet. A soft crunch carried from the far side of the street. It wasn't a boot on bare pavement. It was a foot on fresh snow, a sound that should not have been there. She felt her pulse shift once, like a gear engaging. She raised a hand, palm down, a silent warning. Halloway did not look. Mercer did, briefly, but his gaze tracked past her toward the radio crackle and the GPS screen he was using as a second compass. The crunch came again, this time accompanied by a faint drag. She stepped sideways to the cover of a bus carcass and looked down. A line of prints crossed the street ahead of them, narrow, deliberate, too recent to be from last week's freeze. The prints curved toward the dark hotel. Someone was close. Someone was moving with intent. She inhaled, held it, and considered whether to break the silence that had been imposed on her. The team was already committed to their angle. The chain was already moving. From the corner of the hotel, a shadow lifted and vanished. She kept her eyes on the point where it had been. The snow felt less like quiet and more like a lid closing. Wind funneled through the skeletal streets, collecting in the mouths of alleys and escaping with a low, organ-like note. It wasn't just sound. It was a pressure that pressed against windows, made loose metal chatter, and sent powdery snow spiraling in sheets. The city felt like a lung, taking in cold and exhaling it through broken doors. The team moved deeper. The radio picked up a hiss that hadn't been there on the perimeter. The GPS arrow jittered, spun briefly, and settled in a direction that didn't align with the compass Mercer kept clipped to his chest. They were used to signal interference. They were not used to it here, in a dead zone with no power and no obvious transmitters. Mercer frowned, adjusted his gear, then kept moving. He had a hostage to find and a timeline no one had repeated aloud. She heard the first warning in the wires overhead. A line of old power cables, dead for years, trembled in the wind. One wire, however, vibrated not from wind but from a subtle, repetitive touch. She stopped, tilted her head, and saw the faintest quiver traveling down the line toward the roof of a low building. The wind couldn't do that. The tension was wrong. Something was moving up there, or something was attached and being drawn. She stepped closer to Mercer. "Cable," she said, a single word. It was all she allowed herself. Holloway glanced over, the irritation immediate. "We're on a schedule," he said. He wasn't ordering her to be silent. He was reminding her that her input counted as delay. Mercer hesitated, and then raised his hand to pause the line. His eyes tracked the cable. For a moment the team was still, and the wind did what it did best, filled the gap with noise. He looked to her, then to Holloway, weighing the cost of stopping against the cost of missing a sign. A crack split the quiet. One of the men on Holloway's side buckled. It was not a gunshot. It was a snap, a sudden release, like a cable finally letting go. The man dropped without a sound, his knee folding awkwardly. A thin line, nearly invisible against the snow, cut across his shin, anchored to a signpost, and pulled taut across the path. A trip line. The one mistake experts never make in a cleared zone. Walk into a trap they did not expect. The team scattered into cover. Adrenaline spiked, then tightened into discipline. Mercer shouted to hold. Holloway swore once, not in fear but in embarrassment, and went to the downed man. The line had sliced through fabric but not bone. The man could move. It had been a warning, a test, or a lure. She watched the windows. She watched the roofline. She watched the thin sway of the cable that had been touched. Her mind filled the map with invisible hands. The city was breathing around them, and the breathing was not natural. On the radio, static surged and then fell into a low, almost human murmur. Not words, just the rhythm of speech. It was the kind of interference that could be mistaken for a distant voice. Some of the team froze, listening for meaning, and that hesitation cost them a second. She caught sight of new footprints. They had appeared during the pause, crossing an open space that had been clear a moment before. The prints were lighter than a heavy combat boot. They moved fast. They moved toward the hotel. She raised her hand again, and this time Mercer acknowledged it with a nod. He saw them too. Holloway did not. He was focused on the fallen man, on the line, on the humiliation that someone had been set up and caught under his watch. The team moved more cautiously now. The snow muted their steps. The city accepted them without sound. If the enemy wanted them to follow, they were following. If the enemy wanted them to split, they were already split. A shape shifted behind the hotel's boarded entrance. She saw it through a slice of broken glass. It was there, and then it wasn't. She couldn't tell if it was a person or a reflection. The city breathed out, a gust that rattled a shattered streetlight. Mercer gave the command to regroup. Holloway opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. The radio hissed again. The GPS arrow jerked toward an alley that would have been the fastest line to the hotel. Mercer ignored it. He chose a longer path, more cover, less predictability. It was the first time he had defied the electronic guidance since entering the zone. She followed. She kept the cable in her peripheral view. It was still vibrating, faintly, like a line plucked and held. She didn't know what it meant yet, only that it meant something. The dead city was breathing, and something inside it was moving with the rhythm. The memory came in slices when she needed it least. A hallway, fluorescent and too clean. A door with a code pad. A hostage tied to a chair with tape across his mouth. She had been told to wait. She had been told the negotiator was on the way. She had been told that one command could end everything. She had not waited. The captor had raised a pistol toward the hostage's head. The orders had been clear. Do not engage unless the shot was fired. She had fired before the shot, and the hostage had lived. The captor had died. The command had treated the dead captor as a failure of discipline, not a success of judgment. In the report, her action was unauthorized use of lethal force. In the private words of the person she had saved, it was the only reason I can still speak. The unit had not erased her, but it had quietly rerouted her. Her rifle was taken, not because she could not shoot, but because she could think outside the leash. The leash mattered more to the people who signed the assessments. She had accepted the consequence because she had accepted the outcome. That was the shape of her discipline, and it had made her a problem. Holloway knew the story. He had used it to frame her to Mercer, an insubordinate operator, an unpredictable variable. "She doesn't follow orders," he had said in a room with no windows. "She will again." Mercer had listened, but he had also read her record beyond the line Holloway chose. He had seen the hostage alive, and had seen the after-action notes that hinted at a command structure more concerned with optics than with lives. He had assigned her anyway, under pressure from above, and he had accepted the condition that she would go in without a rifle. Now, in the snow, he felt that decision pressing on him. He looked at her when he thought no one else was watching, as if to measure the weight of it. She kept her face still. She had not come here to litigate her past. The team moved along a service corridor between buildings, a narrow space that kept the wind low and the sound high. The walls rose like cliffs on either side. Snow had drifted into the seam, making the ground uneven. She stepped lightly to avoid leaving deep prints. That was a habit. It also meant she could tell which prints were hers and which were not. They passed a side door with a broken lock. The interior beyond was a dark throat. She saw a smear of fresh snow across the threshold, as if something had been dragged inside. She gestured to Mercer. He hesitated, and then waved her forward to check it. It was the closest to permission she had been given all day. Inside, the air was colder, trapped. The floor was a sheet of ice. She moved in, slow, listening. The space was a maintenance room, empty, but the far wall carried a faint vibration. She pressed her palm to it. The vibration was regular, a low thrum, like a generator. There were no generators in this district that were supposed to run. She backed out and met Mercer's eyes. "Power," she said, another single word. The simplicity was its own argument. Holloway shook his head. "We're not here to chase ghosts," he said, loud enough for the whole line to hear. "We move." Mercer lifted a hand and the line moved, but he did not ignore her. He altered the path, cut slightly east, toward the zone where the vibration had been strongest. It wasn't a full concession, but it was not nothing. She felt the weight of his choice, and did not comment. As they moved, the radio hissing turned into a short burst of clear sound, a fragment of a voice. It was too mangled to understand, but it was a human rhythm. Mercer froze, then raised his hand. The line stopped. The sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the team in a held breath. In that pause, she heard the softest thing, the pressure of a body shifting on snow across the alley. Someone was close enough to hear them stop, to know their timing. Someone was playing the same game of restraint and movement. Holloway leaned close to Mercer. His voice was not a whisper. It was a low grind. "We can't babysit her instincts," he said. "If she's wrong, she costs us the hostage. If she's right, she still broke protocol. We stick to the plan." Mercer stared straight ahead, jaw tight. The plan had come from above, The plan didn't include these variables. The plan didn't include a city that breathed, or a team member without a rifle reading the terrain faster than the rest. In the dark ahead, a faint glint appeared, a reflection from a piece of glass that shouldn't have been there. She saw it. Mercer saw it. Holloway did not. She waited, knowing the moment was building, and the chain of events had already started moving toward their weakest link. Holloway's decision was made without an order. It came in the form of a formation that suddenly shifted, a subtle reconfiguration that pushed her to the outside edge of the line. When the alley widened into a small courtyard, the team fanned out. She was placed in the gap between a collapsed awning and a service doorway, cover enough to stand, not enough to retreat. It was a position a commander might assign to a point man. It was not a position for someone without a rifle. She recognized it as soon as it happened. She did not protest. If she argued, she would be marked as insubordinate in the middle of an operation. If she complied, she could control the movement in her sector and choose how to survive. She chose survival. She shifted her weight. She moved 2 steps back so her profile broke against the shadow of the doorway. She watched the courtyard instead of the building interior, because enemies here would use the open space. Snow fell lightly, the kind that looked gentle but hid motion. A few flakes stuck to her sleeve and melted, leaving dark dots on the fabric. Across the courtyard, speakers mounted on a lamppost flickered with faint orange. A power that shouldn't have existed. The speakers were old emergency broadcast units. They had no reason to be lit. A thin cable ran down the pole and disappeared under the snow. She traced it with her eyes and saw it run to a manhole cover that had been shifted aside by a few inches. The air vibrated. The sound that came out of the speaker was not a message. It was a loop of footsteps, recorded at a distance, the crunch of boots on snow. It wasn't loud. It was meant to confuse. The echo bounced between buildings, making it seem as if someone circled them. She had heard this trick before in training, used in caves, where sound could be made to turn wrong. Here, in a city, it was more dangerous because it could seem like movement when there was none. She glanced back. Holloway had his attention on the far end of the courtyard, where the GPS arrow insisted the hostage was. Mercer had split the line into 2 pairs, with her in the thin middle. If anything came from the speaker's direction, she would be the first contact. If anything came from the service doorway at her back, she would be the last to notice. That was the point. She moved again, a half step, placing herself near a support pillar. It narrowed her angle but gave her a chance to pivot into either line of fire. She did not have a rifle, but she had a sidearm and a knife. The instructions had been clear about what she could carry. The question was whether she would need them. A shadow moved at the far end. It could have been a person. It could have been the echo of one of the speakers. She watched its rhythm. It was too smooth for a recorded loop. She tightened her grip on the pistol, though she did not raise it. If she raised it now, she would be accused of overreacting. If she did not, she would be too late. She kept the pistol low and waited. The speaker spat another loop of steps. The sound now came from 2 directions, slightly offset, creating a false sense of depth. Holloway raised his rifle toward the alley, his finger near the trigger. The men beside him mirrored the motion. Mercer glanced at the speaker, then at the manhole cover, and frowned. He started to gesture, but Holloway spoke first. "Eyes front," he said. She heard a scrape at the service doorway behind her. It was soft, careful. She did not turn her head. She let her eyes drift, catching the edge of the doorway in peripheral view. A shadow crossed the threshold and stopped. Whoever it was had frozen, aware that she was close, unsure if she had seen him. He was testing her like she had been tested by the line in the street. She inhaled and dropped to one knee, not to fight, but to watch the snow. The thin layer on the ground showed a ripple, a subtle disturbance that ran toward her from the doorway. A wire, a trap, a signal. She slid her hand down and felt it. A nearly invisible line stretched low, anchored inside the doorway, leading across the floor toward the courtyard. It was rigged to a device she could not see. She could cut it. She could step over it and hope it didn't trigger. She could shoot the anchor point. Each option carried a consequence. She chose to slide her boot beneath it and lift it just enough to unhook it from its tie. The line went slack. The shadow inside the doorway flinched. That was enough. She had confirmed a presence. She rose and looked across the courtyard. The speaker's loop shifted again, now synchronized with a real footstep. Someone was moving. The enemy was using the sound to mask the sound. It was a layered trick, and it was working. Holloway's posture tightened. He was ready to move. Mercer's hand lifted, a signal to hold. The team hesitated in the snow. The city breathed and held its breath with them. Then the doorway behind her opened wider. A figure stepped into the hall. She could not see the face. The figure's silhouette was tall, armored, confident. He did not expect her to be there without a rifle. He expected her to be blind. She felt the moment tip. The courtyard had become a trap, and she was in the center of it. The second hand on her wrist moved once. That was all the permission she needed. 90 seconds had been a line in training, the window in which a fight decided its own shape. 90 seconds was what it took for an unplanned contact to either settle or explode. She had been told to measure everything in that window. Now she did. First second, she dropped her center of gravity and moved left, away from the doorway toward the pillar that cut the courtyard into two sight lines. The movement was low and fast. She did not draw attention with sound. The snow absorbed it. Second to 10th, she listened. The speakers looped again, but she filtered them out. The real footsteps were heavier, delayed. Someone was moving to her right, likely another operative flanking the courtyard. She couldn't see him yet, but she could hear the snow compress in a steady rhythm. 11th to 20th, she shifted the illusion. She kicked a loose chunk of ice toward the far wall. It skittered, a sharp sound that registered as movement. The silhouette in the doorway flicked his attention toward it. The man to the right slowed, unsure if the sound matched his target. 21 to 30. She used the shadow of the pillar to cover a step forward. She didn't have a rifle, but she did have the courtyard's geometry. The pillar blocked any direct line from the doorway, forcing the silhouette to move to reacquire her. She kept the pillar between them, like a shield made of concrete. 31 to 40. She listened again and heard the slight scrape of a weapon being raised. It wasn't the doorway man. It was the flanker, now trying to find her through the sound. She shifted a step backward, letting her own footprint cross earlier tracks so her path became uncertain. 41 to 50. The speaker loop played and she used it. She moved when the recorded crunch was loudest, masking the real crunch of her step. It was a simple trick, but in snow it mattered. The enemy's advantage was sound. She borrowed it. 51 to 60. She saw the flanker. He appeared at the far edge of the courtyard, a dark figure against the grey wall, weapon raised. He expected her to be where the sound was. She was not. She was behind his line of sight. She closed the distance in 3 long steps and used the edge of a collapsed bench to pivot, forcing him to turn. His barrel came up too late. She struck his forearm with the heel of her hand, not to break it, but to redirect the muzzle. The shot, if it came, would go into the sky. 61 to 70. The doorway silhouette stepped out, trying to regain the angle. He was careful now. The sound trick had failed. She felt the wind shift, carrying her breath away from him. She used the moment to slip along the wall, staying in shadow. Her world narrowed to the rhythm of her steps and the shape of their hesitation. 71 to 80. She used the courtyard's echo. She slapped a loose metal panel, and the clang rolled across the space. The doorway man turned toward it. The flanker turned, hearing the same. For a heartbeat, both were oriented away from her, their attention pulled toward a sound that meant nothing. 81 to 90. She moved. She did not shoot. She did not need to. She wedged herself between the doorway man and the pillar, then used the wall to pin him. A sharp pressure to the shoulder, a twist to the wrist. His weapon clattered on stone. She stepped away before it hit the ground. At the same time, the flanker backed to recover his balance and stumbled over the slack line she had unhooked earlier. He fell into the snow, breath blasting out. 91 to 90. She heard Holloway's voice on the radio, tight and sharp. "Where are you?" It was a demand and a fear dressed as authority. She did not look toward the sound. She finished what she had to do, then answered with the first words she had spoken in the mission. "In the right place." The second hand moved again. The 90 seconds were not over, but the outcome had already shifted. The courtyard no longer belonged to the ambush. It belonged to the one who had understood it. She felt the cold air in her lungs and let it steady her. The city had changed color, not in light, but in meaning. The flanker's fall had made a sound that carried to the rest of the team. Mercer had heard it and looked toward the courtyard. Holloway had heard it and assumed the worst. The radio crackled with overlapping calls, and then the channel narrowed to Mercer's voice issuing a single command to hold positions. He didn't know what he was holding against. He only knew they had been manipulated, and that the center of the formation was now the most dangerous place to be. She worked in the silence between the commands. She did not fire. She did not need to make noise. She moved through the confusion with the advantage she had earned. The enemy expected her to be passive, and her own team expected her to be in trouble. That mismatch was a weapon. The doorway man tried to recover his rifle. She hooked it with her boot and sent it sliding out of reach. He reached for it and exposed his side. She applied a short, controlled strike to his jawline, enough to disorient without breaking bone. He went down into the snow with a dull thud. She stepped away before his body could fall against her. She did not linger. If she lingered, she would be pinned by someone else. Another shadow appeared at the roof line, a third presence watching the courtyard. She saw the outline of a rifle barrel. She could not see the eyes behind it, but she could feel the aim settle. She moved under an awning's remnant and used its frame to cut the angle. The shooter fired once. The round hit the metal frame, sparked, and vanished into the snow. The sound was sharp and clean, unmistakable. It tore the city's breath into pieces. The shot brought the team forward. Mercer pushed toward the courtyard with a small element, moving low. Holloway followed, but his attention was on her. He saw her standing over two downed figures. He saw she was uninjured. His face tightened, not in relief, but in recalibration. The narrative he had been carrying was breaking apart. She didn't look at him. She glanced upward to the roofline. The shooter had moved. The barrel was gone. The wind gusted, carrying the faint scent of ozone from the spent round. She pivoted and moved toward a stairwell she had noticed earlier, the only route that could reach the roof without crossing open space. She did not wait for permission. She did not have time. Mercer saw her move and did not stop her. He recognized a decision in motion. Holloway half raised his hand to call her back, then checked himself as he realized Mercer had allowed it. The chain of command was changing under his feet. She climbed the stairwell 2 steps at a time, the metal vibrating with each footfall. At the top, the roof opened to the wind. Snow whipped across the tar paper in a thin metallic glitter. The shooter was there, crouched behind a vent, trying to reset. He did not expect her. He had expected a rifle at distance, a frontal approach. He had expected a team, not an individual. She closed the space, drew her sidearm, and fired once, not at him, but at the pipe above his head. The pipe burst, releasing a spray of freezing water that stunned him, disrupted his balance, and bought her the second she needed. She closed the rest with her hands, not the gun. By the time Mercer reached the base of the stairwell, the shooter was down. She had not injured him beyond what was required to stop him. She left him alive because she wanted answers. It was a small mercy. It was also a tool. Mercer looked up as she descended. His face was not expressive, but his eyes were. They were telling her he had seen enough to make a new decision. He did not speak. He did not need to. The evidence was on the ground. 3 hostile operatives neutralized without a rifle, the team still intact. The ambush broken. She was back in the courtyard when Holloway reached the downed man's chest rig to check for identifiers. He froze. There was a patch on the rig, half hidden under snow. It was not a local insignia. It was a private unit patch that Holloway should not have recognized, but his face did. It shifted in a way that told her he knew exactly what it meant. The patch was familiar to her as well. It belonged to a unit she had left years ago, one that did the work nobody acknowledged. The implication was immediate. The ambush was not random. It was not a desperate bandit line. It was coordinated, and it had been informed by inside knowledge. Holloway straightened and met Mercer's eyes. He tried to shape the moment, to say something that would steer the interpretation. But Mercer was already moving, already ordering the team into a tighter formation. The window for narrative control was closing. On the radio, a new voice pushed through the static. A strained, clipped transmission that sounded like a distress call. The hostage, or the data, or something else. The signal came from a building 2 blocks north, the place the GPS had been pointing to before it spun. It was now a question, bait or truth. She looked at the patch again. It glowed in the dull light like a warning. 90 seconds had not just changed the fight. They had changed the team's perception of her, and they had pulled a thread that could unravel the mission itself. They moved north with the snow thickening, the wind rising. The team tightened formation without anyone having to say why. The ambush had proven there were more eyes in the city than they could account for. The new transmission had proved there was a voice that could be reached. That was enough to continue. She walked closer to Mercer now, not because she was suddenly welcomed, but because Mercer needed the information she carried. She didn't present it as an argument. She presented it as data. "The patch," she said. "It's from the black unit." Mercer nodded once. He did not ask how she knew. He didn't need to. "That unit shouldn't be here," he said, as if speaking the words made them less dangerous. Holloway heard them and interjected. "Black units have contractors," he said. "Could be anyone." His voice was controlled, but it carried an edge that suggested more certainty than evidence allowed. She filed that away. He was trying to shape the story again. As they approached the building with the transmission, the snow began to show signs of disturbance, not from wind, but from foot traffic. There were tracks that crossed and recrossed. Some were old and half-filled. Some were fresh, sharp, recent. The fresh ones overlapped, circling, as if the people who made them had waited there for some time. A staging area, an ambush point, or a guard detail. Mercer slowed the team. He ordered 2 men to take high positions in adjacent buildings. He placed Holloway on the left flank and herself on the right. This time it was not a trap. It was an allocation based on what he had seen. Holloway noticed. His jaw tightened. She said nothing. The building ahead was a municipal records office, the kind that held paper, and, when the city died, held secrets. The front doors were half buried by drifted snow. A side entrance was open by a fraction. A line of melted snow ran from it. A thin, wet trail that suggested warm air inside. That meant power, or a recent presence. Either way, it meant someone had been there within hours. They approached in silence. The radio buzzed. A second transmission came through, clearer now. It was a whisper, a voice repeating a phrase. "Lower level, east stair." It was either a guide or a lure. She had learned long ago that in operations like this, the first voice was often a lie, and the second was a test. Mercer made the call. He split the team again, with Holloway taking 2 men around the front, and her taking 1 man around the side. The split made sense tactically, but it also moved her into a position where she could see Holloway without being seen by him. The snow reflected the faint light from the office, creating a soft glow. It was enough to see the outline of Holloway's hand when he reached into his pocket for a device that was not standard issue. She didn't call it out. She simply watched. The device was small, likely a jammer or transmitter. He held it low. He glanced toward the roofline, then toward the alley. The movement was too quick to be casual. It was a signal, not a habit. Inside the building, the air was warmer. The hall smelled of mildew and dust. Paper lay everywhere, scattered by wind through broken windows. Their boots left wet prints on tile. She moved ahead of her partner toward the east stair. She paused at the base of it and listened. The lower level held a hum, faint, steady. She could hear the clicking of a relay. Someone had set up equipment. That meant the hostage was real, or the data was, because the equipment needed power. As she descended, she heard a rustle above. She looked up and caught a glimpse of Holloway's silhouette crossing a balcony on the upper level. He was moving fast, not toward the hostage, but toward an interior office. His radio was silent. He was not announcing his movement. That was a violation. She filed it as more than a suspicion now. It was a thread thick enough to pull. She reached the lower level and found the hostage, or what remained of the situation. A man was tied to a chair, alive but exhausted. A laptop was open on a desk, its screen lit, its drive connected. The man's eyes lifted to her and widened, not in fear but in disbelief. He expected a different team, a different outcome. She cut him loose. "Stand," she said, the command simple. She didn't explain, didn't reassure. She didn't have time. She grabbed the drive and handed it to her partner. "Up," she ordered, and he moved. Behind her, a muffled explosion thudded from above, far enough to be contained but close enough to be intentional. The building shuddered. Dust drifted from the ceiling. She knew immediately. Someone had set charges, not to blow the place completely, but to collapse specific exit paths. It was a kill box, and they were inside it. She looked towards the stairwell and saw Holloway at the landing, his silhouette framed by the dust. He raised his radio to his mouth. It was an instant of choice. He could warn them, or he could seal their fate. He did not warn. The radio stayed silent. The truth bled through the snow, and she saw it clearly. He was not just arrogant. He was complicit. The building shook again, this time closer. The stairwell behind her groaned. A chunk of ceiling fell, slamming onto the steps. The normal exit was gone. Mercer's voice came through the radio, sharp now, demanding a status report. Her partner answered with the hostage secured and the data in hand. She added a second line. "Exit compromised." She did not mention Holloway. She needed Mercer to see with his own eyes. Mercer moved fast. He reached the lower level through a service ladder on the far side, a route she had marked earlier when she read the building's layout from the scattered maps on the wall. He arrived with 2 men and a rifle in his hands. He took one look at the collapsed stairwell and then looked at her. In that moment, he made a decision that was both tactical and symbolic. He handed her the rifle. It was a standard-issue weapon, heavier than the sidearm, familiar in her grip. The gesture did not carry an apology. It carried a clear shift. She would now act as a full operator, not an observer. She took it without ceremony. If there was vindication, she did not show it. "I don't shoot to win arguments," she said, her words spare, direct. "I shoot to get people out." Mercer nodded once. "Then get us out." They moved the hostage toward a maintenance tunnel that led to the building's rear. The tunnel was a narrow concrete channel lined with pipes. The air was damp and warm. Another sign of live systems. The pipes trembled faintly, carrying vibrations from the street above. She felt each footstep there, not from hearing but from the way the pipes hummed under her hand. It was another map, another layer of information. Ahead, a heavy door blocked the tunnel. It should have been locked, but the lock hung open. The snow outside glowed with a bluish light. It was the storm reflecting off the sky, or it was something else. She paused. Mercer paused. The men behind them held position. The hostage breathed in shallow, controlled bursts, trying not to panic. She opened the door and stepped into a side alley where the snow was deeper. The blue light came from a flare burning low near the far exit. The flare had been placed to draw attention, to make silhouettes. Someone wanted them seen. She signaled Mercer to hold. She moved along the wall, rifle low but ready, and peered around the corner. Holloway stood there with 2 men blocking the alley's mouth. He had positioned them so that if the team exited, they would be forced into the flare light and into his line of fire. It was a clean kill zone, and he had built it himself. She did not speak. She aimed the rifle not at Holloway but at the flare. One shot shattered it, plunging the alley into dimness. The snow still reflected light, but the sharp glare was gone. It was enough to break the advantage. Mercer stepped out and raised his rifle toward Holloway. The two men at Holloway's side hesitated. They had not expected to be challenged by their own commander. Holloway lifted his hand slightly. "Mercer, this is above you," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were a different story. They carried urgency and calculation. Orders came from command. "Orders to kill a hostage?" Mercer asked, keeping his rifle steady. "Orders to contain a breach," Holloway said. "The data is toxic. The witness is a liability. You know how this works." Mercer's jaw tightened. He knew exactly how it worked, and that was the problem. The chain of command could label the hostage a threat, the data a risk, and the team a cleanup crew without any of them ever having been told. He had been placed in an operation where the mission might have been to erase rather than rescue. Holloway had known it. He might have even helped plan it. She kept the rifle steady, pointed low enough to avoid a shot, but high enough to hold the space. She did not want to kill him. She wanted him to stand down, to step aside, to allow the extraction. She could see that he would not do it willingly. "Move," she said. It was not a request. Holloway's gaze flicked to his men. They were uncertain. He had authority, but it was cracking. Mercer had command, and she had just earned the rifle. The balance had shifted again. The storm pressed in, flinging snow down the alley, blurring their outlines. The city hid them, as if offering to erase the decision they were about to make. One of Holloway's men lowered his weapon. The other hesitated. Holloway's face hardened. He took a half-step forward, and in that movement she saw his intention. He would force a confrontation that could be blamed on chaos. He would claim she fired first. He would claim Mercer lost control. He would claim the mission failed because of her, and the chain above would accept it. She did not give him that chance. She pivoted, aimed at his leg, and fired once. The shot was precise, controlled, non-lethal. He went down into the snow with a shout swallowed by the wind. His men froze. Mercer moved in and secured them. The extraction path was open. The hostage moved through the alley, the rifle now hanging from her shoulder, as it had always belonged there. She did not smile. She did not look at Holloway. She was already thinking about the next door, the next corner, the next lie that might be waiting. The rifle was not a symbol now. It was a tool to get people out. They regrouped at the perimeter of the city as the snow thickened into a white curtain. The extraction vehicle idled in a sheltered pocket, its engine the only steady sound. Mercer ordered a rapid debrief right there, in the cold, because he needed to control the narrative before it was controlled for him. Holloway sat on the snow with his back against a wall, his leg bound, his face pale with pain and anger. He did not look at her. He looked at Mercer as if trying to appeal to rank and regulation. He spoke in the language of procedure. "You violated chain of command," he said. "You fired on a superior officer." Mercer's eyes did not waver. "You set a kill zone against our extraction," he replied. "You jammed our radios. You triggered charges inside a rescue site." Holloway shook his head. "We had standing orders," he said. "You know the kind. The city is compromised. The data could bring down a division. We don't let that walk." She stepped forward and held out the drive. "This," she said, "is evidence. Evidence gets moved, not buried." She kept her voice flat. She did not say it for him. She said it for Mercer and for the men listening. One of the operators, a young man who had nearly lost his leg to the trip line, looked at Holloway with a new expression, something like betrayal. Another man, older, who had been in the unit longer than Mercer, kept his face blank, but shifted his stance away from Holloway, aligning his body with the commander. It was a quiet vote. Holloway's voice sharpened. "You don't know who you're protecting," he said, gesturing at the hostage. "You don't know what he did." The hostage met his gaze. "I know what I did," he said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken, and his voice carried more authority than his appearance suggested. "I documented it. That's why I ran." Mercer looked down at the drive, then back at Holloway. "You were willing to kill a witness to protect a command decision," he said. "That's not discipline. That's cowardice." Halloway stared at him, a flicker of disbelief. He had believed he was acting in the interest of the unit. He had believed the chain above would protect him. But in this moment, surrounded by his own team and the evidence of his choices, he saw that protection was uncertain. He had been exposed in the snow, and the snow showed everything. She didn't press the point. She didn't need to. The 90 seconds in the courtyard were now part of the unit's memory. They had watched her operate without a rifle, and then with one. They had watched the arrogance that dismissed her crumble under evidence. The question of who the burden was no longer rhetorical. The answer sat in the snow with a bandaged leg and a broken story. On the radio, command came through at last, the voice clean and measured, asking for status. Mercer answered with a report that was direct and incomplete. He stated they had the hostage and the data, that the city was compromised, that internal interference had been discovered. He did not name Halloway on the open channel. That would be handled in a different forum. He understood the chain. He also understood that if he allowed the chain to rewrite events, he would lose the men he led. As they loaded the hostage into the vehicle, Halloway made a final attempt to assert control. "You're making a mistake," he said to Mercer. "They won't back you." Mercer looked down at him. "They're not here," he said. "We are." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of command in a way Halloway had never managed. She stood to the side, rifle slung, watching the city fade into white. She did not feel victorious. She felt an old, familiar fatigue, the kind that came when you saved people and still had to defend the saving. The burden she carried wasn't a weapon or a title. It was the responsibility of knowing right from wrong in a system designed to blur the line. The vehicle door closed. The engine revved. The city shrank behind them, swallowed by snowfall, as if it had never held their footprints at all. They drove out through a narrow corridor cleared earlier by the storm crews. The city disappeared in the rearview mirror, not as a skyline but as a blank wall of white. The snow erased the tracks in minutes. The only proof they had been there was the weight of the drive in Mercer's bag, and the bruise on Halloway's leg. Back at the forward operating base, the debrief began in a sealed room. Mercer reported the compromised mission, the ambush, the unauthorized interference. He placed the drive on the table and slid it across to the intelligence officer. He did not mention her discipline record. He did not mention the empty sling. He reported what he had seen and what he could prove. She stood at the edge of the room, not invited to sit. That had not changed. But when the intelligence officer asked who had neutralized the roof shooter and secured the hostage, Mercer answered with her name. He did not embellish. He did not apologize. He simply spoke the truth into a system that often avoided it. The hostage was taken to a secure location. She asked for one thing: protection for him. A real protective order, not a temporary relocation that could be reversed with a phone call. She did not ask for commendation. She did not ask for her rifle back as a trophy. She asked for the person she had saved to survive what came next. The intelligence officer glanced toward Mercer. Mercer nodded. It was not a promise, but it was the first step. In this world, steps mattered more than words. Later, in a corridor outside the debrief room, Mercer stopped her. He did not speak with the paternal tone of a superior. He spoke plainly. "I let discipline blind me," he said. "That won't happen again." She looked at him. The apology did not erase what had happened, but it acknowledged it. She held his gaze and answered with the same kind of plainness. "Discipline isn't wrong," she said. "Using it to dodge responsibility is." Mercer nodded once. He understood that distinction now because he had watched it play out in snow and concrete, and a 90-second shift that none of them would forget. Halloway was moved to a holding unit pending investigation. He did not speak again. His silence would not protect him from what had been discovered. The patch, the device, the charges. Those things would lead to deeper questions. The drive would answer some of them. It might raise more. The official report would be classified. The story would be whispered. In the unit, the 90 seconds would become a legend. The moment when the operator without a rifle turned the fight. Some would repeat it as a tale of skill. Others would repeat it as a lesson in arrogance. She did not care how it was told. She only cared that people got out alive. The snow outside the base kept falling, burying the tracks of the day. The city remained a white tomb, but the file that came out of it was black with secrets. She knew it would be sealed, labeled, stored in a vault where truth waited for someone brave enough to pull it out. She had done what she could. The rest would depend on the courage of others, and on whether they remembered the moment when everything changed color. The snow did not forgive. It hid, it muffled, it erased, but it never forgot. In a city where silence had learned to breathe, a team had entered with orders, with pride, and with a quiet decision to ignore the one member who had been punished for choosing life. She had walked last with an empty sling, and she had listened to the city more closely than anyone else. The hook held because it did not explain. The danger was there at the outset. A cracked street, a broken window, an insult carried like a badge. The tension grew not from the volume of gunfire but from the weight of restraint. Every decision had a consequence that followed logically, and every twist came from a choice made under pressure. The 90 seconds were not magic. They were the result of attention, terrain, and timing. She did not overcome the enemy with tricks that belonged to movies. She used sound, shadow, and the geometry of a courtyard. She moved when the city allowed her to move. The enemy's confidence became their error. The team's skepticism became their weakness. The shift in power was earned, not granted. Dialogue remained scarce because words here were for commands, not for comfort. The team did not bond. They moved. The city did not explain. It pressed. The emotional weight was carried in what people did. Mercer altering a route because he trusted her warning. Holloway designing a kill zone because he believed the chain would protect him. Her taking the rifle not to prove a point but to extract a hostage. By the end, the resolution came with cost. Holloway was exposed, but the larger system that enabled him remained. The hostage was saved, but the file was sealed. The city returned to silence, but the unit carried a story that would sharpen their judgment. The snow erased the tracks, yet the 90 seconds endured as a legend, a reminder that in a world of rigid protocol, sometimes the right choice was the one that kept someone alive.